to presentation on the Way of St. James. This is something that, well, I'll explain. I did over a course of a couple of years.
Santiago. Santiago.
Say again. So anyway, I'm just going to dive right in, explain what the, well, first, let me move to the next slide. And here, what you can see is, we'll start with the Camino de Santiago in Spain, down in the lower left-hand side. And that is what most people are familiar with.
I think I'd rather watch it. Yeah, I can like focus.
I think some audio is overriding. So the Camino is the Spanish portion, which runs across from the French border to the Camino, or to Santiago de Compostela. And the portion we're going to be talking about is one of the four main routes that you can see in France, specifically the one that's second from the bottom, that starts at a small city called Le Puy. And just to mention, you can see there's four cities that start these main feeder routes to the Camino. And each of those has a significant cathedral. And the cathedral is the beginning point. I think everyone probably knows what cathedral.
Gives you an idea of the whole, what the walk is like.
I think most people are familiar which cathedral it is in Paris, and perhaps haven't been as familiar with the other
And then
ones.
he got sick. Didn't he have an appendicitis?
Is someone not muted?
To stop.
Okay, so I'll keep going. And I'll move to Le Puy. This is a small city in sort of the south central of France. It's a major religious center for the Catholic Church. It is in a region called the Massif Central, which is a elevated region of ancient volcanic activity. That's a little significant in Le Puy itself, because there's volcanic outcroppings. For example, right in the very center of the city, there is a volcanic cone where the cathedral and some statues are located, and then the city surrounds that. I came into here one day early just to do a little bit of scouting, and I was able to visit some of the locations. For example, right in the center of the city at the top of the hill is this statue of the Madonna on the left. And that's large enough to go inside and look out. Only a fraction the size of the Statue of Liberty, but something very similar in construction on a smaller scale. In the upper right, we have a large chapel, really a small church, up on the top of this volcanic cone. And it's really quite large. It's hundreds of feet up in the air. To try and give some sense of scale, there are people on the front steps of the church that are so small. And in bottom right, since I was there a day early, I thought I would scout the beginning of the trail. And that road right in front of me is the trail in the city before you leave it. And I thought it would be important to stop and just get a sense for what kind of traffic I would see on the trail. Now, the next morning, which was Monday morning, I thought I would go to the cathedral proper to begin the trip because it is the official beginning. I thought I would just walk in and put my foot inside the door and turn around and walk away. And this is what I found when I walked in, quite to my surprise. There was a large gathering of people, even a Monday morning, and these people were largely there to begin their pilgrimage towards Santiago. And the priest at the church that was giving a blessing, and I stayed to hear the rest of the blessing, the end of it. And as I got ready to turn around and begin the trail, a great many of these people took their paper passports that are issued, and they were flocking around the priest to get their first stamp in their passport. And as you go through the various churches, villages, and accommodations along the way, you can get various stamps in your passport as you go. So after the blessing, I turned around and walked out the cathedral to start this trip. And it's rather easy to find your way in the city. You can see the bronze medallions that were embedded into the street and sidewalk. There was blazes as well, which we'll see later. And it was easy to follow your way along the trail right out to the edge of the city, where you saw the first sign, for example, in the bottom right-hand side. And this is typical of the marking and signage that you find on the Way of St. James. It's the standard blaze is white on top of red. It's well marked, good distance. Often there is some explanatory text like in the bottom, and it's always in French, and quite often there's an English comparable translation as well, because we're lucky we speak English. Everyone in the world has their choice of reading the French or reading the English.
All right, now make sure you unmute yourself.
So I continued on the way, and it was only a few kilometers and you're out in the countryside. And this is a really fairly rural part of France. So right away, we're in a small village. They had another signboard there explaining the area. It's already common to walk through pastures or right next to pastures full of livestock, such as goat herd, or old farm implements, such as the top right, which I think is where they would put bulls for unpleasant activities before they release them. And then beautiful farms already that you would see, like in the bottom right, stone construction. And in this part of France, and much of France, the actual main barn is directly attached to the farmhouse itself. So that structure on the right-hand side attached to the farmhouse is something you see quite common there, where it's the barn, and I suppose you could pass straight from the house into the barn then, unlike the American farms. And then very quickly, we got to the end of the first night, or the first day, and I took a few pictures here in this village, not because it was special, but because it was very typical. It was a small village centered around an old chateau on the hill above, where this picture was probably taken from, where it had the church. The hotel itself was top right, typical room, nothing special or fancy, but that was my accommodation for the night. And then for dinner and breakfast, typical restaurant, sort of family style with tables in France. Now that we're on the trail for a day, I think I'll stop and pause and just talk about what I had arranged to give you a sense of the kind of trip I was doing, because you can do these trails in different ways. And this is how I did it. So the first 2 weeks of the pictures we've seen so far were from August of 2017. And that particular leg that I did was from Le Puy to Conques, which we haven't been to yet. And then 2 years later in August, I came back and picked up in Conques again and went to another small city or large town called Lectoure. And then just this last August in 21, I was able to return to France, and I completed the final 2 weeks from Lectoure to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. And in total, that's officially 742 kilometers. But I recorded my walks in each of those 3 years and managed to walk about 800 kilometers because of the side routes and such. Now, the different ways to book it, you can do it in group, in occasion. In my case, I did it self-guided, and it was largely village to village. But a significant amount of the accommodations were also in the countryside. It could be farmhouses or gîtes or something that you would be going village to village, but that's not necessarily where you'd be stopping for the evening. And I booked it so that I had private rooms en suite essentially everywhere, meaning I had my own private bathroom, which is not at all taken for granted when you're doing these trails. And I booked it with half board, meaning that my dinner and breakfast was included with my stay overnight. The types of places we stayed at, small hotels, sheets, B&Bs, farmhouses, could be a room or a suite in a private home. And each night might be something different. I put them in order of what I stayed in during the 6 weeks. More than anything else was small family-run hotels, and then gîtes and so on. And for lunch each day, the vast majority of people do some local takeaway at a shop. It's in the town that you happen to be in. And there's a lot of bakeries or boulangeries that specialize in making sandwiches for takeaway. And that was probably, I had sandwiches, part of a baguette, more than anything else. But I came to realize I enjoyed a takeaway slice or two of pizza or a small quiche each day or something else for lunch as well. And I arranged so that I could have a baggage shuttle for one item. And typically, people would have either a roller bag or a duffel bag. And then you only have to carry a day pack. And when you leave a place in the morning, you just leave your bag behind. And the shuttle service comes by at some point and picks it up and delivers it to where you're walking to. So more or less, it's usually waiting for you, although sometimes it takes an hour or two to arrive after you've arrived. And just put in sense, this is a slightly more expensive method and a little bit more luxurious than what most of the people I walked on the trail with. A lot of them would walk with everything in their backpack, or they would stay in hostels most of the time, or even in campgrounds and do camping. And I just looked up the other day, the first 2 weeks, and if you book Le Puy de Conques, for example, which we're covering first, you could do it right now for about $150 per day. You know, as a package with like a British walking company or something like that. And then when I was on the trail, I was typically doing 10 to 15 miles per day. That was between the accommodations. So you plan your day between going from one place to the other. This part of France is largely rolling hills and valleys, maybe typically not more than 1,000 feet per day over that 10 to 15 miles, sometimes more. Sometimes harder climbs that you would notice. And it seemed like maybe one time per week, you'd have an 18-mile day or 20-mile day, which, you know, are noticeable. The way, the route is well marked. So staying on trail is not particularly difficult. What I found more difficult and I paid more attention to was making sure I knew the exact location of the accommodation I was going to each day, because that could just be the more difficult thing for navigation. And I tried to think what were the downsides, like potential hazards. It was August, all 3 years. That's the hottest month over there. It's raining, wet rocks, just like anywhere. And on week 3 and 4, I got into a section for probably a good week, and unfortunately it rained during the nights and everything was wet, where I was into this very slippery, sticky clay. When you were on any kind of incline at all, the clay was as slippery as ice, but it liked to stick to your boots. And before you knew it, you could have 1 or 2 inches of thick clay hanging off your boots. So it looked like you were walking around with lumps of clay on your feet. And eventually when it got too heavy, you just have to stop and scrape it off and start all over again. So we're back on the trail. Just some of the kind of common but pleasant sights you see. Top left-hand side, there's chapels, not everywhere, but often enough that are just along the way, and people can stop and contemplate or visit or donate, whatever. And this was one I thought was a very nice setting when I went in, so I took a photo. Top right, there's artwork here and there along the way, and someone had taken a tree and turned it into a rather nice looking sculpture. And you'll notice in the middle of the tree, there's a white shell or scallop. And I haven't mentioned so far in the Camino itself and the Way of St. James, the symbol for a pilgrim or a walker is the scallop shell. So you'll see that in many things. It's a theme that just runs the entire trail. Bottom left, we have people are they like to show their classics or something special. And it wasn't unusual to see someone put out a classic car at a farm, just right on the trail, so it's a foot away, just so people can see it as they walk by. And that bridge in the bottom left had a historic marker to let people know that Eiffel built more than just a tower in Paris, for example. He built that bridge as well.
John, this is Susan. Can I just interrupt for a second? I wanted
Yes,
to
please.
invite our participants to, if they do have questions, as John is going through the presentation, to please put them in the chat. And also direct you, Lisa Shustak just made a comment about her trip in 2013 about pricing. So you might want to take a look at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. And yeah, anyone has any questions, I'll try and deal with them, or real time, or if that doesn't work out, we can cover some things at the end. Besides a small hotel like what I showed earlier in a village, another very common and pleasant way of traveling, maybe my favorite way, was when you'd stay at a gîte. And these are a variety of places, typically a little bit in the countryside or outside the village. They're run by a family normally. It's a couple, the kids are there, they live there. They're your host for the evening. It's a very pleasant setting. They usually have beautiful gardens, always things to eat and drink. Lots of picnic tables outside for people to catch up at the end of the day, get prepared the next morning. And this was just a classic one in that first week, an old farm and a sort of grand farmhouse that had been converted into accommodations for walkers. Here was an interesting village. It's a rather remote section of France. And this particular village, which I don't really want to try and pronounce it because I know I get it totally wrong, had a problem in the 1760s with wild wolves, which were preying on people, not to mention livestock. And it became quite a scandal in France at the time and attracted royal attention in Paris. And they sent special hunters, and there was stories about people, like a young woman who fended off one of the wolves who tried to attack her. And here we are 250 years later, and it's still what the village is most famous for. So they celebrate it very enthusiastically, sort of, I suppose, like Nelly and Loch Ness. It's their claim to fame in the world. And the countryside there, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this was typical in that volcanic region. Soil's not particularly good, not many farms, lots of pasture and livestock, lots of cattle. You can see the trail often ran between the pastures and the fenced areas, like in the top left. But often you were walking right outside of the pastures, say on a road, like in the top right-hand corner. And this one was interesting because instead of cattle, it had water buffalo. So I just speculate that the local farmer was making mozzarella as opposed to other dairy products. And these poor water buffalo, I was walking down the trail on the road there, and they were sure I had treats for them because they all crowded right up next to me at the fence and were, I'm sure, hoping that I gave them something, or at least it seemed that way. And then herds of other cattle, like in the bottom right. And occasionally you wouldn't be walking outside the pasture. You would be walking inside the pasture. You'd go in a gate and you would travel some distance and go out the opposite side through a different gate. And I'll spend a moment talking about this particular pasture I happened to be in because it was quite large, and I had entered on the one side, and it probably was, I don't know, a quarter mile or a half mile across. And I couldn't see the far side when I entered it, but I went in and the path is obvious through the middle of it. I get a few hundred yards from the far side and I see this herd of cows standing right in front of the gate, which is behind the cows here in the picture. And that wasn't unusual, but what caught my eye was this big fellow, which was one of the herd bulls. And he's from hundreds of yards off, he's just stopped and started staring at me. Now, one of the bits of advice when you do these kind of walks, you'll see the various livestock in the various pastures, but the one pasture you never go in, you stay out of basically all the time, is any pasture that has bulls in it. They're dangerous and unpredictable, and you just don't go there. Well, here I am walking towards this gate, and I see this guy who's got to weigh a couple, a ton or more, just staring at me like, what are you doing? This photo, I was not close to him. That's a telephoto on my camera. I took this picture, and then afterward, I took a huge semicircle around to the right, staying as far away from him as I could. And then I got to the gate on the far side and slipped through before he decided to become animated.
John, we have a question from Barb, and she's interested in knowing did you get to meet or get to know other travelers?
Yes, and in fact, I'll talk more about that later. In this first part of the presentation, I don't. But it's very similar to other long distance trails. You end up being part of a moving community along the trail. And there are people you see in the evening or at lunchtime, or you walk with on the trail, and people, you pick up new people and you lose people and you leapfrog each other, and you can see somebody for a day or two and then not see them for 3 days and then see them again. So a component I haven't discussed yet is, very much so, there is a social aspect, very similar to the AT. But the difference is people aren't stopping for the evening at shelters, and they are staying at campsites if that's how they prefer to do it, because most of the villages will have campsites on the outside of them. But a lot of people are staying in the hostels and the gîtes and the hotels. And you might see them there in the evening, as opposed to like around shelters. So continuing on, upper left-hand corner, this was an above average beautiful village. It's just very picturesque, and I wasn't surprised when I saw a sign that said it had been designated as like one of the 50 most picturesque villages in France. And that large building in the upper left-hand corner, by the way, is the chateau of the village, otherwise a castle. And it is where the lord or nobility back in the day before the French Revolution would have lived, and then probably controlled the whole town, the whole valley, and whatever surrounding area. So there's a great many chateaus associated with the various towns and villages throughout the whole countryside. Something that was interesting is the bottom left. That man has swung his arm behind him and is getting ready to bowl. So this was one version of French bowling that I happened to just stumble across. It was on a side alley, and you can see the pins that they have in the ground posted up there in the front. And he's ready not to throw the ball. This was a very curious way of bowling I had never seen before. He took that stone ball and he swung it around to the front of him. And in his left hand, he is holding the 10th pin, or maybe the 9th pin. And he used the stone ball to hit the pin in his hand and ricochet it down. And that was the first strike, the first ball. And then for the second follow-up, he actually threw the stone ball down. And I didn't stay too long, but it was obvious they were trying to get all the pins down, just the same as our bowling. The reason why they were doing that was because I stumbled into the city fete for the summer. And the fete is their summer festival, which sometimes you're just lucky, you happen to be there when it's going on. It's sort of like a county fair in the United States, and they do the same type of things. They have parades and music and food and refreshments and just fun. And I think this will work if I push this. I give you a small video. This was quite a long parade, but I only have a few seconds of it. And it seemed like everyone was really enjoying it. And they were all lined up through the main street in the village. And the young people were especially enjoying themselves. And it seemed one of the requirements was that they enjoy beverages quite a bit during the course of the parade. So I was in that area for 2 days walking in Soltefet, and then I moved on. And the countryside varies quite a bit. You could be on a farm road, you could be on a dirt track in the forest, you could be on a gravel track like in this upper left-hand picture. And the picture really doesn't do it justice, but really what caught my eye, other than you can see the blaze on the right-hand side too, with typical marking. There was an exquisitely built bridge just ahead there in the center of the picture. There's kind of a dark circular thing. That's where the creek ran underneath the bridge. And it was so remarkably well built. I couldn't guess how many centuries that bridge has probably been there, totally made out of stone. And now the trail goes over top of it. It is an old road that's no longer used. It's just forest now. Or as you pass through villages, you're not even stopping at, like in the upper right-hand side, and just beautiful bridges and lots of rivers. And very minute later, I was passing over that bridge and through the town and out the other side. And bottom left-hand side, for example, that was clearly an estate for someone in a position of privilege. And it was a little bit outside the town I stopped in that day. Or the bottom right-hand side, that was an old cobblestone road that was in the middle of forest and field. Some of these roads could be sunk down 5 and 10 feet in the ground, where you could see they had just been worn by the centuries. And I had to walk on those cobblestones for a few kilometers and just wonder how many centuries that road had been there, because the road itself has been used more than 1,000 years. It became quite famous in 951 when the Bishop of Le Puy himself engaged in a pilgrimage to Santiago and popularized this particular trail as a pilgrimage route. And for centuries after, it was very, very important, sort of say kicked off by that bishop in Le Puy. Now, of course, it's still very popular, but it was in its peak probably in, it could have been 1200, for example. And 2 weeks have gone by and I'm in Conques. So this is a beautiful preserved medieval village. Cars are largely not allowed to drive in the center. Everything, it's a historic district, the entire village, basically. Some of the businesses and residents are able to have controlled access to their properties inside the village, but everything else is excluded, and it's kept in this medieval state with the stone roads and stone buildings and so forth, as you can see. Very beautifully done. Hard to get to, as I found out when I returned 2 years later. But a little side, when you leave the trail, I usually take trains around France more than anywhere else. And I was in this major train station the one day, and I looked at these seats and I said, well, this is definitely above average seating for a bus stop or an airport or a train station. And this lounge chair was wide open, so I took it for myself for a while because I had a little time to kill in the train station. And by the way, you can see my classic accessories that I travel with on these trips. a duffel bag, and a carry-on, and my straw hat for the sun. And so after the picture, I sat down and I thought, oh, this will be great. I'll sit here for half an hour longer. And what I hadn't noticed is there was this little dome above me, a parabolic reflector with a speaker inside it. And it started whispering right above my head, stuff I could not understand. It was like, really was quite distracting. So my real nice rest was shortened because this constant whispering right above my head. So I moved on. And 2 years later, in 19, I was back in Conch. This is backside of the cathedral. You can see how medieval the whole city center is kept. There is the pilgrimage accommodation right where those two people are coming out. It was a pretty dreary, wet day to get there. And of interest, you can see just two of the stone coffins that were back in the day reusable, that were laid up in the back of the church in that grass. There was a whole row of them in the day, and maybe today, where people would have a grave where they used a coffin and then they reused the grave 100 years later and recycled the coffins. Upper right-hand corner, left-hand corner, got Rue Charlemagne. That's the GR65. I walked out of the village. Very quickly, you're back in the countryside. It's not unusual, like in the top center, where you're at a crossroads and you'll see some kind of small shrine or cross. That particular one, I walked up to it and I had to make a left-hand turn and continue. Nothing special, but just a very nice scene. Livestock throughout the area. Could be cattle, horses, donkeys, mules. I was up close in the top right-hand corner. There were a few goats in the field, and this one goat was very motivated and clever. He would partly climb up on this fence because he wanted the leaves from that tree that were outside his fenced-in area, and he was doing a pretty good job of getting them. And then the hotel on the bottom right rather, was just a nice one. I had a night there, an accommodation, and it's very pleasant along a river, and then on the next day again. Here we have some scenes from the countryside. In the top left, this is a water point at a farm. It's kind of multi-purpose. So it was their well. The well's on the right-hand side, and it fed a few basins. One was a livestock basin in the very far right, and the basin that's sort of in the center of the picture there is a washing machine. And you'd see a lot of these, I'll call them washing machines, because they would have the washboard on the one side. These were all stone, but they would make them out of stone, and they would have the sloped side to them where people would take their clothes and they would put them on. And just like some of us might remember from years ago, actually have a washboard, and you would wash your clothes and rinse it back out and wash it again. And these kind of relics of the past are all along this trail. In the top right-hand corner, there was one area for a few days I walked through where these all stone, they appeared to have nothing, even the roofs appeared to be nothing but stone structures. And I would explore a few of them and never could quite figure out what they were. Some of them were wells inside, but others looked like shelters. I'm not sure if they were shelters for the shepherds or for the livestock. But in any case, this one region that took a couple of days to walk through had these just dotted throughout the countryside. And another day in the bottom left-hand corner, I was on the trail and I heard quite a racket coming towards me around the bend where those trees are at the top of the picture. And then I caught spy of just hundreds of sheep coming my way, what looked like on the trail. And I thought, maybe it'd be smart if I step off the trail. So I took a few steps off to the left, and it was only moments before this herd of hundreds of sheep just filled the entire trail and were pouring past me because they were being driven at the back. I came to realize by a farmer on a four-wheeler and his sheepdog. So I caught a few pictures. Even the cows in the field were startled by this racket of hundreds of sheep being driven apparently from one pasture to another. In the bottom right-hand side is another classic type of accommodation in the countryside. This was the owl. And I always appreciate it when they would have a graphic of the name of the place. So now I know what the French word for owl is, for example. And there were just two of us walkers there for the evening at this place, run by a family, a beautiful small country home, beautiful gardens, but they made a wonderful dinner and a great breakfast, a nice place to stay, and you're off the next morning again.
We have a question from Dan. Dan
Yes.
wants to know, were these medieval villages electrified? I didn't notice any electric poles in your photos.
Yes, everything's electrified now, but you can see that virtually all of this countryside and most of the buildings were not originally constructed when there was electricity. And but they're all retrofitted now, and there's modern plumbing, there's electricity. So all the let's say the the luxuries of modern life exist there now, but you can see in so many buildings where they've had to retrofit it to make that happen. So in front of the owl that I just showed in the previous slide, I saw a structure that was overgrown, kind of right on the corner of this village. It was a tiny village. Back in the day, 100 or 200 years ago, it probably had, dozens or a few hundred population. Now it's just country homes and a few farms. But this derelict building directly across the street road was the old village bakery. And I explored it a little bit, and it was totally made out of stone. And it was basically one massive large oven. And you could see where the local residents would not bake their bread each morning in their own place. They would walk down to the central bakery and bake their bread every day in this one oven and then take it back home again. So that was kind of common. So further down the trail, I got into a fairly medium-sized city for a night. This particular bridge is somewhat historic. It cannot accommodate vehicles. It's too small. It was designed and is still designed for pedestrians and perhaps carts and horses. And it was a fortified village or a city like so many of them are, maybe the majority of any place of significance from the centuries ago when they had to physically defend themselves with gates and walls and moats and so on. And most of those fortifications are still in place for people to see as they go by. Bottom left-hand side, this one I saw a mile away. There was some very large fields of blue crops. And the picture doesn't do it justice. It was a much more vivid blue that day as I was going by. And as I got close, I realized they were flowers. And I don't know what kind of flower, but I mean, usually you don't see large fields of flowers. Maybe some places you do. And I passed a dirt road that led into a farm that had a sign saying it was some kind of botanical garden, I suspect for perfumes or some kind of essential oils or something. But anyway, that was a very pretty sight. And then on the right-hand side, this was a sign of status, power and privilege in the day. Only the nobility at time by law were allowed to put this kind of structure on their estate, and it was often very close to the main chateau or country home. And that is a pigeon coop. And it was both a practical and a hobby and a prestigious thing. Very large pigeon coops. It was kind of like bragging rights for how many pigeons they had.
This is what was happening.
Okay.
And on a practical basis, they would gather the pigeon droppings.
Gotta do this.
The pigeon droppings were valuable for both fertilizer in the gardens and also for various industrial applications like tanning hides and things of that sort. Another accommodation in the upper left-hand corner. This was an old grand country home that had been converted into a gîte or a B&B. And it was run by a retired Belgian couple who had decided this was going to be the great way they were going to retire. It was pretty remote. It was not near any village at all, but it was directly on the trail. And I had been booked by one of my booking companies into here. And it was very nice in a variety of ways. Like you can see the picture in the bottom right, which was part of their back garden with orchard way off in the distance was part of the property, but the place was somewhat run down. They had great food. They tried to put on a great restaurant, but I kind of missed the action on this night because I was the one and only guest in the whole place with the couple. Occasionally, like in the upper right, you see these beautiful little set pieces. That was a spring. They have various pools that the spring was fed from and fed to. So just very nice. They often get turned into gardens. And then the cat, the black cat, sometimes during the course of a day, some of the most enjoyable things can be just small little quirky events that occur. And that was the case in this day. I was walking down the trail and there was a very nice bench, and I decided, oh, it'd be a great place for a rest. So I just sat down on the bench. And a few minutes later, this black cat just wanders out of the woods, gets on the trail, pays me no mind, and just starts walking. But then directly in front of me on the trail, about 4 or 5 feet in front of me, just simply plops down like a human, not like a cat, and it's facing directly towards me, like 4 feet in front of me, right in the center of the trail. And it's got its legs out in front of it. It's sitting on its behind. It's not sitting like a cat, it's sitting like a person. And for a while, it was just staring right at me like, okay, you're taking a break, I'm taking a break. And by the time I got my camera out to take the picture, it was looking around and seeing what else was going on. And this cat took a rest, sitting up on its rear, right in front of me for who knows how long. And then finally said, oh, time to move on, got up, and both the cat and I started heading down the trail. There were a few days in the second 2 weeks where I had to walk along this canal. And those of us who are on the Delaware River and elsewhere are familiar. This was a still active operating canal. It had a very wide towpath. The towpath is not used anymore because everything is self-propelled. The top picture you can see, these are either people's primary residence or second homes or holiday homes. And most of them, there wasn't a lot of movement on the canal. They were mostly just tied up. Bottom left is a classic design that's common there. And the bottom right is a lock, modern locks, still operating, with the old lock keeper's home there as an office, or I'm not even sure it was used as a home like it would have been originally, because they could drive to and fro each day during operating hours easy enough. But this was interesting to go down for a few days down that canal system. And then I came into another village that was historic and medieval, and automobiles essentially not allowed inside the center of the village. A few scenes, statue of St. Jacques in the church there. Down below on the left-hand side, that circular structure was, back in the day, one of the most important structures in any town of consequence. That was the grain hall. And that's where the farmers and the merchants would gather during market days, and they would buy and sell the grain that the farmers brought in from the countryside. Some are quite much more elaborate. This was a medium-sized town, large village. So its hall wasn't huge, but that grain hall has been standing there a number of centuries, and a bell tower. And in the same village, I thought it was interesting, the top right-hand side, This was a community center that was clearly based on water. Everything in this buried sort of underground, almost like an archaeological site, was water related. And I think it was for the livestock, it was for people's drinking water. And on the right-hand side, underneath, that is the village washing center. And there again, you can see that slope side on the back, on the right-hand side, where people would come and they would wash your clothes in that wash basin and take them home, I suppose. And I got into another section with like the background I'm using today. There's different crops in different areas, and the trail is long enough where you move into different regions in France. And this particular region was growing a fair amount of wheat. And it was not unusual to see scattered poppies on the fringes of the fields or scattered through the fields. But there were so many poppies in a few of these fields that it almost looked like it was intentional that they were planted, not just remnants from a year before and they'd gone to seed. They were very pretty, so I took a few pictures. Bottom right, I think Bill suggested that could be onions. I don't really know what that crop is, but it was just very nice to see acres and acres of this extremely well-tended crop right on the trail. And then the bottom left-hand side, this is the walkway and road into a small village. And it's extremely common, in fact, very common, that the entrances in and out of villages are lined by grand sycamore trees. They could be a few centuries old. This village took a different take on it, and they were training their sycamores so that the branches would create an arch. And it was just something special that all of us passed through as we walked into this particular village. And in the top right-hand side, something else in a plaza in one of the villages. These ones, they had decided to top all the sycamores, maybe 20 feet up, and then they were letting them grow in a circular horizontal pattern out from there. So like a disc of vegetation on the top of this rather large trunk of a sycamore tree. There's artwork kind of casually throughout along the trail. Some I like the best. I took pictures of top left-hand side. This tiny village, it had been a village, had a little welcome display. They had made a few people out of clay pots, and even the watering can was the direction and distance to the larger village, 1 kilometer down the road, just to let the walkers know they were on the right track. Welcome to them to the area. The one in the bottom left was a little weird. That was a modern farm growing corn, as you can see, in their fields. And they decided to have this structure, which I couldn't quite make out what exactly. He was, I guess, guardian of the farm. He had a fire extinguisher in one hand, and I'm not quite sure what in the other hand, but he was kind of an intimidating sculpture you walk by. And buried in the back dirt roads and some farm and fields, someone had taken a tree and turned the trunk into their version of Saint Jacques on the right. So I thought that one was worth a photo. And I'm finished on the 4 weeks. So we have in the top left-hand corner, the end of my 2019 walk was the large village of Lectoure. And you can see it's elevated above the surrounding area. In fact, the history of Lectoure is that it was initially put on the map, let's say, or in the history books, by the Romans, who put a fortified encampment there. It had strategic advantages, and they were in charge or in control of southern France at the time, and they made an encampment there. Probably was settled before that, but that's when it made the history books. And to this day, it's fortified, and the whole village has a wall around it, like so many do, because at one point it was the seat of a noble who lived up there, and needed to protect the town. Other scenes you can see, just back gardens you walk by, or old aspects of farming life gone by with old wells, and they couldn't put every kind of picture in. It would have been too much, but there were wells and carts and wagons and just here and there and sheds and in the fields and so forth. And in the bottom right-hand side, this is, I returned just August, about whatever it was, 7 months ago, to do my final 2 weeks. And I found that I had moved into an area where this year, at least this year, or 21, they had planted large crops of sunflowers that were just exceedingly attractive to look at and walk by. It's really pleasing. And that the size of the fields were like large cornfields in the US, say eastern cornfields, like in Pennsylvania or Ohio, not maybe like in Iowa. But, you know, dozens or hundreds of acres of very beautiful and bright sunflowers that I was fortunate to be able to walk along for the first number of days on in 2021. There was something unusual about last year. There was a little extra paperwork. Had to get tested to come back to the United States. Had to do passenger locator forms traveling in and out of Europe. Definitely had to have my vaccination and my COVID card, or I would not have been allowed to go to France. And everywhere inside last summer, I don't know the current situation, but any building you went in anywhere, you had to have a mask on, even though COVID rates weren't especially high last August, but masks were required anywhere. And France had just implemented what they call the Pass Sanitaire, or Health Pass, which is an app with a QR code on your smartphone. And basically to go in anywhere, to check into a hotel, to eat at a restaurant, to get on a train or a bus, you had to show your Pass Sanitaire. And I didn't have one. Americans couldn't get one in August. So I had my CDC vaccination card up there in top center. And I must have shown that dozens and dozens of times in the 3 weeks I was in France, 2 weeks on the trail. Because since I had no Pass Sanitaire on my phone, I would show my card. And very fortunately, it worked pretty much 100% of the time, with a few amusing stories I won't go into today, but that got me through France last summer. I'm not even sure what the current regulations are there, but if anyone has any plans for international travel this year, I found this to be a somewhat taxing, kind of notable complication and extra amount of work and attention to detail that was required for international travel in these days. But it was worth it. I was stubborn and patient enough to just plow through all the requirements. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to have gone back last year. It just wouldn't have been possible. And now I'm back on my last couple weeks. This last summer, very first day, I walked to this village in the upper left-hand side. And while I was sitting at an outside cafe table, everyone was very pleased when this biker gang came rumbling into the town center and all pulled in and backed up their bikes. And of course, they were all classic mopeds. And this was some kind of classic moped club. And they were out for a ride. And I was very impressed when a number of us all went up and looked at them more closely. And somewhere on the front of the bike, usually between the handlebars, they all had a small license plate that you can see in the upper right-hand side. And that was the exact day that they were out riding, the 8th of August, 2021. And I guess I even have their itinerary there. And it was just very fun to see this biker gang roll into town and stop and have some lunch or a refreshment, and then off they went again on their mopeds. Other things that were common to see on the trail, bottom left-hand side, that's a water pump, French style. And I know many of us would know about the old water pumps, mechanical ones that we had years ago, where it'd have an arm on the side and you would pump it up and down. The style in French, like this one, would often have a wheel on the side, and it would have a handle, and you spun the wheel around, and that operated the pump. In this case, bring the water up and fill up the basin, overflow, and so forth. And then some people, like in the bottom right-hand corner, not uncommon, say they didn't exactly have suburbs, but let's say the outlying areas of a town or a village where there was more residential homes on individual plots of land, people would put in nice displays. And here someone had taken an old, I suppose that's a hay wagon or hay cart, and repurposed it as a flower planter. And just one of the nice things that you'll see as you go along these trails. In the top right-hand corner is a typical welcome sign as you move from region to region. And you can see this particular plaque. This was last summer. They even identify 3 or 4 regions, and I've just walked into the one that's highlighted there. I wish I could pronounce it properly. Armagnac, Tenzerez, or something of the sort. And most of these signs will highlight and promote their local specialties. And this particular region was very popular or famous for a local beverage. It's in the top right-hand corner, and for faux gras. And this actually is not faux gras, the picture in the bottom left, that's pate, various types I had, but I put it in there. And on occasion, eating a sandwich in a baguette with a slice of ham and cheese is not entirely satisfying, although most days it was. And so you could be in a village and you just decide to stop at a pizzeria and get yourself a pizza for lunch. And those were pretty good days too. And you'd have something like that for your lunch. Instead of a slice of pizza, you'd get one fresh made for you. And then in the evening, a great variety of things. Most meals in the half board, when you're having dinner and an accommodation, are like a nice family meal. Maybe 3 courses, nothing extravagant or special, but sometimes it is a bit special. Like I was especially happy at this particular restaurant because I like cheese, and their cheese cart was wonderful. And cheese is mostly served as part of dessert at the end of the meal. And I definitely went back to that cheese cart a few times to try a variety of those cheeses that they had on offer. More like in the bottom right-hand side, a nice dinner one evening that was served at a place where that was a little fancier and nicer than usual, or I wouldn't have taken a picture of it otherwise. Or the bottom left is a classic picture of a breakfast: coffee, yogurt, juice, fruit, and off to the side you can't see, there'd be a croissant, maybe part of a baguette and some other bread and some butter. And that would be your typical breakfast that you'd have each day, and it'd be very satisfying. I took this particular picture because this place decided that my cup of coffee should be in a huge cup about the size of a large bowl. And it was a bit unusual, which is why I put my hand next to it just to show how big that coffee cup was. Oh, in the top right-hand side, every night you would get, or you would arrive at an accommodation, and I would travel with a duffel bag. Most people had roller bags, and they would be waiting for you, but they wouldn't be in the room. Off the lobby or in a corner of the restaurant or something of that sort was where all the bags for all the walkers had been placed. And as you came in, you would check in, and then you would go over and pick your bag up, and then you would take it to your room. And that works really pretty well. But on occasion, you would have to go up something like this particular staircase. I was up like 3 or 4 floors. You can imagine going up these circular stairs, which were really rather narrow with your luggage and your pack and so on. But it all worked out. But that one was worth a picture back down after I'd carried my duffel bag up top. Another thing those who travel in Europe know is they're more careful with their electricity. So if you're staying in a small family-run hotel at night, they do not leave the lights on in the hallways. They have motion detectors. So if you leave your room and you go out in the hallway, it can be pitch black. And generally it is when it's dark. And it's only the motion that turns the lights on. And so it's kind of, let's say, unusual by American standards that the hallways in hotels are usually dark unless there's a person in them to activate the switches to turn them on. And then they're on timers and they only stay on for a few minutes and go back off again. They have trail magic on the Way of St. James. It's not the same as the trail magic we have here. But for example, on the left-hand side, someone had been nice enough at this apple tree to put a little crate down at the bottom. They put some of the apples in there and a little sign basically saying, serve yourself, help yourself. Or you could help yourself off the tree. I'd like those ones even better. And you could see the blaze. Classic blaze over there, it's the red and white for the Way of St. James, or GR65. And then this must have been a joint trail with another, that's what the yellow marker is. And you can see how they indicate, in this case, a right-hand turn. So I'm on the GR65 with the white and red blaze, and I can see that just a short distance ahead of me, it's going to be taking a right-hand turn down whatever corner of the street and instead of doing our blazes where one might be offset above the other one, they would do it in this fashion where they would kind of put the indicator left or right depending on how the trail went. Bottom right-hand side, I was on a farm. The trail ran right at the boundary of the farm. They had put up this table with some bins of cherries that they had picked, I'm sure, right off their own trees. They had an honesty box and a little sign saying, you know, help yourself to the cherries. They're for, you know, it's for the children. And so I did help myself to one of those, from those bins of cherries, and put a few euros in the box and enjoyed cherries and left pits on the trail as I went down for the next kilometer or two. And then occasionally you just run into berry bushes along the trail, like in the top right-hand side. And if you want, you just stop and enjoy the berries. This sign, this fence in front of a home, I thought was rather amusing, so I added it to the presentation. I thought it was a bit of contradiction, or sending mixed messages, you might say. The friends are welcome. And apparently if the bad dog doesn't get them first, and if you're just passing by and not stopping, or the bad dog doesn't get you, they give you a nice friendly warning to watch out for the kiwis underfoot for the next 1,200 kilometers. So I thought that was very helpful and nice. And the other thing that was unusual is it's all in English. On these trails, there is English on these official signs, and occasionally here and there, but there's not much else that's in English. So this was unusual. Maybe it was a British vacation home or something of that sort that had English. And Barb had asked about life on the trail. I just only put one slide in here to represent that every day you're seeing people you know, you're walking with them, talking with them, stopping for lunch, having dinner. And these were some of the people that I met in the final 2 weeks last summer. The top right-hand picture, there were 3 French couples together from Paris. We fell into the same accommodations a number of nights and would leapfrog each other during the day at times. They were just great company. One of them was an artist. I got his Facebook page so I could take a look at Michelle's artwork, which is available for those who are interested. The 2 ladies in the bottom left, Sophie and Marianne, I had very good fortune in running into them the first week. They had never done a long distance trip before, but our accommodations just happened to coincide for about half of the first week. They were just great company. And they were also fun in that I remember the first day we were having dinner one evening, and one of them said to me, John, did you see tomorrow's distance? And I was like, no, I actually didn't pay any attention to it. Why? They go, 28, 28. And I was like, oh, okay, 28. Yeah, that's long. I'm like, I'm doing a little math in my head. That turned out, I think, to be about 18 miles. And as I was saying, on this particular trail, you tend to do 18 or 20 mile days, maybe once a week, something like that. And they had never probably walked that distance before. I said, oh, it's no problem. You just do it one day, one foot in front of the other. So anyway, they were fun. And in the bottom right-hand side was Christian. Christian was German. We fell in and walked together a number of days. He was mostly staying in sheets and hostels, and I had hotels. So we'd spend the days together and lunch, but then he'd be off to one place in the evening. I'd be off someplace else. But he was great company. He had walked from Cologne, and he was stopping at Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port as well. And Cologne is quite a distance. So he had spent a good chunk of the summer walking, and we just happened to end up when I arrived be more or less on the same schedule. He had two nicknames the French gave him. They have sort of trail names, but it's not the same tradition. But he told me that the French had given him two names, and one was the man who likes beer. And the other, which was even more rare, or very rare, the German who could speak French, because his French was very good. And sometimes when two or three of us would be walking along, and I'd be trying to have a more complicated conversation on a deeper topic with some of the French, our language was not good enough, my French and their English. And Christian knew English and French as well as he knew German. And he could be kind of a translator and help keep the conversation going. Anyway, I also mentioned this stela that he is leaning on is a monument where the three of the four major pilgrimage roads in France come together only about a day and a half short of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. So we're getting close to the end of the trip. And it's a notable spot because here we've got what I showed earlier in at the beginning of the presentation, those four main trails, three of them converge at this point. Oh, this one, we have adventures once in a while. And here we had gotten into a village early and we decided to have a nicer lunch. And I think everyone knows around here in Pennsylvania area about how aggressive the yellow jackets can be in the summertime. And this large cafe, which was very popular, was no exception. In fact, it got so bad, I decided to use my phone to make a short video. So imagine these are yellow jackets. And they were just more and more and more descending on our table. Anyway, I was able to finish my fruit cup, as you can see in the foreground. My French friend with his other fruit cup abandoned it. And on we went, found our accommodations after that nice lunch.
We had two questions, John.
Yes.
One regarded, and I believe what they were asking is, did you plan and execute this trip with other friends, or were you traveling alone? And the second question again had to do with the terrain. How much of it was flat and how much of it was rolling or mountainous?
Okay, on the first one, all three trips I did solo and self-guided. So they were, except for 21, when I went over to France just to finish up this trail. 19 and 17, they were in conjunction with other adventures I had happening in those years. But for this particular trail, I planned it myself, and I went myself, and I was a solo hiker, except for when I was spending time with my trail companions on the trail or in the accommodations, that type of thing. And the second part is there was basically no flats anywhere on this. In fact, on this slide, you can see the bottom left-hand picture. Of course, now we're getting into the Basque Country, but the picture on the right-hand side on the bottom, you can see it's just rolling hills and valleys, and it was from the beginning, and it was most of the way. So I'd say essentially nothing was flat the whole time, although the center 2 weeks was more of a week 3 and 4 was more of an agricultural region, and I would say it was less hilly and less deep valleys than the first 2 weeks or the last 2 weeks. So now we're getting close to the end. As I entered the Basque region, there were already signs of it. For example, road signs started being in both French and Basque, or administrative buildings along the road, like in the top right-hand side, would be in both languages. And I might be able to recognize some of the French, but I definitely do not think I've ever seen Basque before I entered this region. And then that bottom right-hand side picture, your classic Blanc and Rouge waymark, and the trail runs just on the right-hand side of those posts. And all the way on the far hill, you can see the trail going up and over the next hill after a deep valley in between, actually quite a bit drop in between, and then climb back up on the far side. So, oh, and this was maybe for 2 days. By the time I got to this point, I'd been able to see just hints of the Pyrenees in the haze in the distance, but now they're starting to appear, more pronounced. So those hills in the background are the beginnings of the Pyrenees mountains. And I've arrived at Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. And it was quite a shock when I got here, because the last week walking into here was extremely remote, very rural. The villages where you had accommodations. In this case, I stayed in a few farmhouses, a few B&Bs where just local residents would have a spare bedroom that they would put a hiker up for the night. Villages that did not have train service or bus service. In fact, it was about a week earlier, many people fell off the trail because it was the last place that had regular transportation services back to Paris and other cities and so on. And if you continued the additional week, the second week I did, you were pretty much in the countryside. And so it was very rural and quiet. And all of a sudden I walk into Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and when I saw this touristy train, tourist transport coming up the road in front of me, I knew I was back in, quote, civilization. It was August, that is holiday season in France and much of Europe. And there were a lot of tourists in town. There were a lot of hikers in town, because this is the place where people who do the Camino almost always arrive and begin their walk into Spain, which takes 1 day from here. This is still in France. But they arrive here and then 1 day walk, they're in Spain for the rest of their Camino trip. And just the top right-hand corner was the hotel I had for the last night. Bottom left-hand side is one of those kind of classic pictures you'll see of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port with the river running through it. And the next morning I was at the train station with my trusty duffel bag and straw hat, backpack in the corner, waiting for the train to arrive to, in this particular case, take me to Bordeaux, where I connected to another train back to Toulouse, and concluded my hike. This is final slide I had here showing basically what I've just been talking about, from Le Puy to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. Oh, and just so it's not confusing, this map says Le Puy-en-Velay, which is Le Puy in the valley. And it's a tiny little part of Le Puy that's directly adjacent to it on the one side where the train station, the bus station is. And but Le Puy-en-Velay and Le Puy are the same. So with that, I'll open it up to any kind of questions, follow up, whatever anyone wants to talk about.
Holly, would you like to ask
Sure.
Jess about footwear?
Yeah. John, I was
Yes.
just curious what you wore on your feet, because initially when you were talking, cobblestones and gravel paths and so forth, I was thinking, no, not my limbers, not any high boots. And then sort of towards the end there, where it became, more pastoral and so forth, I wasn't sure.
Well, since I have a second bag, a duffel bag that gets transported, I can be a little more luxurious. So I would tend to take three things for footwear. And what I walked in the most would be just a pair of Merrell Moabs, sometimes waterproof, sometimes the ventilator. I like Merrells. So probably on all three of most of this trip, I would have that. But I'd also take a pair of trail shoes, and on occasion I might wear my trail shoes instead. And the third thing I always have, whether I have the trail shoes or not, I have my boots, and I'll have a pair of hiking sandals. And some days I'll hike in the sandals, or sometimes, maybe more often, I save the sandals for the evenings in the morning when I'm in a town or a village and having dinner and so on. So I hike in the boots, and then I have my sandals for the evening.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions and such?
I have a question. John, the accommodation, did you book beforehand or did you go on the spur in the villages?
I booked everything in advance. I would do the 2-week bookings. I knew what my destination was each night. I would say only a quarter to a third of people book that way, where they had the luggage shuttle and they had the advanced reservations. The majority of people will stay in gîtes and hostels and campgrounds, and they tend to be all Europeans. I didn't mention that aspect of it. There are almost no Americans on this trail at all. In the first 2 weeks, I think I saw 2. In 2 weeks, I saw 2 Americans. And almost no English speakers, native English speakers. In the second 2 weeks, I ran into a small group from Australia, and I saw maybe a Brit, a Canadian, and American. On my last 2 weeks that I just completed last year, there were 0 people from outside the European Union on the trail, and most of them were all French. So I was literally for 2 weeks the only native English speaker, the only one who wasn't a European resident on the trail the entire time. And that matters. I bring that up because many of them would casually use their cell phone and book their reservations 1 to 3 days in advance. And so they weren't necessarily looking at the end of the day for where they were going to stay that night, but they would be calling ahead and making a reservation for maybe the next night or the next 2 nights kind of arrangement.
John, we have a question in the chat and I'll read it. What was your inkling that you wanted to do this hike? I think the person wants to know what your first thought was that got you here.
Well, I booked the first 2 weeks from Le Puy to Conques almost by happenstance. It just fit into a larger schedule that I was doing in Europe in 17. And I found it, and I thought it looked interesting, and it worked with the rest of the schedule. And so I plugged it in and did it. And it was just charming. And I enjoyed it enough that it encouraged me to go back and do the next 2 weeks. And then again, last year to do the final 2 weeks. So it was not any grand plan. It wasn't on my bucket list originally. It was just that once I did that first 2 weeks, sort of coincidentally, I very much enjoyed it and continued after that. I'll mention too, since they're almost all Europeans on this trail, even the Europeans would tell me often, the people I would walk with, they didn't even know about it much. They would have, for example, gone and done the Camino, maybe the year before or 2 years before. And they would explain to me that when they were doing the Spanish portion is when they learned about the French portion. And they were coming and backtracking and doing a portion that they hadn't known about until they were doing the Camino proper in Spain.
Hello, John. This is Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Hey, a couple little comments. Those bridges that you saw in the very beginning that are arched like that, they're called a Genoese bridge. They were created in Genoa back in the, I forget which century, long ago. And they'll come to that little narrow peak there. But another thing about festivals is you can always in the villages there'll be some central bulletin board, which Lynn and I would go to, and they'll always be posted on that numerous types of events and music, festivals and such. And we discovered a Fête du Pain, which is a festival of bread once, where at one of these big beehive stone ovens, they baked all these bourses or big bowls of bread. And then they had a huge table with soup and this bread, and you just sat and ate family style, elbow to elbows with somebody. And even though the person running it couldn't speak English, he would sit you next to somebody who did, and you could enjoy this whole festivity elbow to elbow. So it's very worthwhile, if anybody goes there, to look for these posters and find festivals. Some of them are musical, but it's definitely a great way to rub elbows with the local and that sort of thing. So
yeah, I fully agree. You're correct. In my case, since I have this predetermined schedule, it was just my good luck whether I was in a given location when they were having a fete or not. You had the flexibility. You could actually go and stay and be there during it because you had transportation. But I agree, they're worth it. They're just an enjoyable event to attend, and I've been lucky enough over the years to be in the right place at the right time and never regretted being there at that time, even though it can be a little crowded and noisy at those time periods.
Two questions, John, that have to do with trip planning. Number one, did you use an agent to make your bookings once you knew the towns you wanted to stop in? And also, could you talk about what the camping or backpacking accommodations are like?
On the first question, it's more the other way around. Is my preferred way when I do a multi-week trip in Europe is to do a package booking with a walking company. And there are companies, especially in Europe, that specialize in booking multi-week trips. And I used many for many years. And so when I had this little, for example, for the first 2 weeks here in the Puy, I was just browsing through dates and locations of packages. And so I booked 2 weeks and then 2 more weeks and then 2 more weeks. And that was 3 bookings for 6 weeks on the trail. The first one is a British company out near London. That today they changed their name. They're called Walker's Britain. The weeks 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, they're harder to find with English companies, English language companies. So I booked with, some people may have used Max, M-A-C-S. So the second booking and the third booking were both through Max, which is okay. They did a fine job for me. Maybe not my favorite company, but in all of these cases, by the way, I found out that the underlying booking agent is a French company that operates essentially only in French. I know where their website is. I could have booked my second trip and my third trip directly with the French company, and got a little bit better deal. But my French really isn't good enough. So I used one of the English companies for convenience and for language certainty and so forth. But for those who had, say, like Jim, I know his French is much better. If he was interested in this kind of trip, he would probably have the confidence to just go straight to the French company and book with them. And they're the ones who actually transport the baggage and make the hotel accommodations night by night. Was there another question there?
Yes, two more. Did you have a favorite section and would you do anything differently? And also a question about bicycles on the trail. Were there bicycles on the trail or do bikes have their own trail?
Okay. My favorite section was the first 2 weeks. It's just very charming in that Massif Central, very remote. That's what kind of hooked me on the trail to come back. The second midsection from Conque de Lector was not as enjoyable. The clay and the wet probably didn't help, but it was more agricultural. There was a fair amount of farm roads that you were walking on. So it was like walking through farm country. It was enjoyable, but not nearly as much so as the first 2 weeks. And then week 5 and 6 were very nice again. Bicycles in most of it, you would see an occasional couple guys on like hybrids or even road bikes covered in mud, doing kind of hardcore biking on the trail, but not very many at all. In the last 2 weeks, last summer, I ran into sections where there were couples in particular, they were using e-bikes, and they would have, 2 e-bikes. They were doing the luggage shuttle type thing. So they were being supported, and they could cover 2 to 3 days of the trail that I would walk. Yeah, but they would do it in 1 day with these e-bikes, and I'd occasionally be stopping with them as well for meals or rests or crossroads or comparing navigation notes, things of that sort. So I did notice them much more in this 2021 trip than I had in previous times. And then the rare, more hardcore, mud splattered regular bicyclists as well. I saw this last couple of weeks as well. And then I'll backtrack. There was a question about the camping or the backpacking. And I would say I would not describe it as backpacking, although others might, depending on the definition. There is a great percentage of the people who carry everything. They don't have a luggage shuttle. Maybe, in fact, the majority of people carry everything they have along the way. But I wouldn't describe it as backpacking our style. There's really no wilderness. There are established campgrounds, with lavatories and showers and snack bars and such, usually on the outskirts of the towns and the villages. And a lot of my trail friends that's where they would go in the evening, and then they would camp, and that was the most economical way of doing it. And so they were carrying tents and their sleeping bags, and the campgrounds might have meal service or not available as well. So there was a lot of that, but people didn't camp in stealth camps or in the woods or at traditional campsites like we would, that you might just walk by on the AT, or there's no things such as shelters. There were all these commercial campgrounds where they would pay a fee of, I'm not actually quite sure how much it was, 10 euros, 15 euros per night type of thing. And I forget what else you had there, Susan, and questions?
Yes, let's end with that question because I think it's a good one. Is there anything you would do differently if you did it again?
I'd consider whether to do it in August. August is the hottest month. That's not enjoyable at times. I ran into a section about 4 or 5 days this last trip where it was upper 90s and even over 100 one day. So the heat of August maybe wasn't great. But on the other hand, that's the holidays month for the Europeans. And I got to meet a lot more people and hike and be more embedded with the Europeans and the French in that they were on the trail in larger number during that month. So I guess that'd be my answer, is maybe consider a different time of year. And with that,
Yes, thank you so much, John. It was a wonderful presentation, and thank you for all the people who tuned in and were part of this. Appreciate it so much. I don't believe Lenny is with us anymore. So I am unfortunately not able to announce what next month's meeting will be, but stay tuned and check your calendar for the third Wednesday in February. Good night, everybody, and thank you.
thanks everyone for
Thank you.
joining.
Thank you, John. It was great.
Marvelous. Thank you, thank you.
Fantastic.
Beautiful, beautiful photos,
Thanks so much, John.
All right, take
beautiful
care.
photos.
Thanks,
John.
very much. Good night, everyone.
Yes, thanks, John.
Right.
Night.